All right, and we're off. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out here tonight. Well, coming out, joining us virtually for this episode of Birds and Bites. This is our riff on the Birds and Beers programs that we used to do, where we would visit a brewery and, well, get a brew and talk about birds. Obviously, we do that right now, but we still wanted to provide an opportunity for everybody to kind of gather in kind of setting and drink a beer or wine or whatever, water, whatever your choice is, and still talk about birds and nerd out with your fellow bird. My name is Edward. I am president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and this is our kind of long, at this point, 2020 and hopefully beyond virtual program. Thank you guys for coming out here tonight. I'm really excited to our program topic and our guest here this evening. But real quick, because it is a riff on our Birds and Beers program, we do have a sort of beer sponsor for the evening as well. So I'm going to quickly pass it over to Francis Kane to introduce our partner brewery for the evening. Francis?
Hi, everybody. I'm Francis. I am going to plug Five Rabbit, which is actually the first US-based Latin American-inspired brewery. And their slogan is that they hope to bring the energy, passion, and amazing richness of Latin culture and cuisine to the delicious world of craft beer. If you want to support them, they are located at 6398 74th Street in Bedford Park. So we'll link that in the chat. And they have really delicious beer. I'm not drinking beer tonight, but if you are looking for a new brew to try, definitely give them some support. So great.
Thank you, Francis. And just in general, all of these breweries that we've partnered with have been fantastic partners, not just to COS, but to birders in general. They've opened their doors to us, to our gatherings, supported us in spot events. So certainly right now, as things are difficult for a lot of local businesses, please consider, supporting them and throw bucks their way, because they've been fantastic friends of birders and the birding community for a long time. And it'd be great to help them during these tough times. So thank you so much to Five Rep for being our partners for the evening here. And real quick, some quick housekeeping. Again, we are recording this stream, so I will be in the background going through with that mute hammer. So please make sure you keep yourselves muted at least while Doug is presentation here. At the end of his presentation program, we're going to have time for questions. So if you have questions that come during the course of the program, go ahead and put those in the chat. I'll be keeping. And then when we reach that point, I will call on you. I'll be keeping tabs on your questions. I'll call on you, and you can then unmute yourself, ask your question in person. So we can see your lovely face, hear your voices, and again, try to keep things a little bit more personal here this evening. And then I think that's all of my notes I have to cover here. Just again, this is part of a series, so if you wanted to see any Birds and Bites episodes that have passed, our YouTube page where all of those recordings are up, and any future Birds and programs that are coming up, or other virtual programs, or even in-person programs, you just got to go to chicagobirder.org/events, and everything will be listed there. So without further ado, y'all here to listen to me talk. I'm going to go over and hand it over to Doug, Senior Conservation Ecologist at the Field Museum, and just generally longtime expert Chicago birder. Take it away, Doug.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to start sharing my screen and hope everything goes according to plan. And there we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. So what I'm going to talk about is bird migration in the Chicago region. I can talk for several hours about this, but we'll try to keep it to 40 minutes or so. So in Chicago, there are about 290 species that migrate annually. There are other species that are rarities that increase that number, but about 290 are regular. An estimate of 20 to 30 million individual birds using the Chicago area each year, and about twice as many individual birds in the fall and the spring. The major groups of, I should say up front, you're mostly going to hear about landbirds because that's what I'm mostly interested in. I'll talk a little bit about shorebirds and some other things, but mostly it'll be landbirds. The major group of songbirds include 32 species of regular warblers, 18 sparrows, 10 flycatchers, and thrushes, vireos, wrens, blackbirds, etc., in smaller diversity. I counted up that there are 19 species of birds that are resident in Chicago. So that means that the populations that are here year-round. The individuals that are here are year-round. There are species that are here year-round, like blue jay, that are nonetheless migratory, but these are ones where the population is largely resident. Note that it includes 5 introduced species, which are marked with an I. There were 3 species of grouse that occurred in this area. They were all resident and they're now gone. So Chicago is really important for landbird migration because it's immediately north of the corn soybean desert on the shore of Lake Michigan, which concentrates the birds, and it makes it a critical stopping off point for migrants. It's the first green space basically they hit for hundreds of miles. This shows the Illinois land cover, and you can see the pale kind of buffy area is corn and soybeans for the most part. And other than a couple of river valleys, it's all corn and soybeans. Okay, so one thing that's nice is we can see migration on weather radar. And this is a night of migration, October of 2013. And I've got here the URL that I use to look at migration. And basically what you're seeing here is all birds. There's a little bit of weather down in the south. You can see some lines that aren't those circles. That's weather. When Tom Skilling shows you the radar on the nightly news, he takes out the birds. I don't know why he does that, but ornithologists like the fact that we can see birds. And the reason we can see birds is it's moving water, and the Doppler radar picks up that moving water. It's the same reason it picks up the weather. And as the colors get brighter, they're more. This is a night of pretty good migration across the central part of the country. You can look at the radar at a much tighter level. This is a spring night just after sunset, where the birds are starting to rise up out of the places they spent the day. And if you look on the left shows what the cover looks like, the right shows the birds coming up. And the purple areas have the most birds, followed by reds, and they're fewer as you get out into the yellows and greens. And the thing you can really see is you can see the birds coming out of the river valleys all through here. So we can see the Kankakee, the Illinois, the Chicago River, the Des Plaines River going north of the city, and then the forest preserves south of the city are well represented as well. One thing I would just point out is you don't see any birds coming off the landscape, lakefront. And the lakefront in the spring can often have no birds because of lake effects. And this is one of those days where there just aren't birds on the lakefront. Okay, so I want to talk about spring migration compared to fall migration. In the spring, migration is more compressed, so the birds are moving more quickly. So warblers basically are migrating through per species about 3 weeks in the spring, and that extends out to about 5 weeks in the fall. The birds are a hurry in the spring, and they don't stay around as long. The males come through first, females come through later, and then in the fall there's no sexual difference in when they come through. The males come through first because they're in a hurry to get to the breeding grounds and set up territories. It's not the early bird gets the worm, it's the early bird gets the best territory. So that's what drives the males to move through first. The weather conditions when they're migrating in the spring are worse than they are in the fall. So for, essentially the spring and fall migrations are mirror images of one another. And in the fall, it's about 3 to 5 degrees warmer on average on sort of the equivalent migration dates. The other thing is in the fall, if the weather is crappy, they can continue. They can continue and get to warmer weather by going south. In the spring, typically going on means you're flying into worse weather. So this compares at O'Hare the temperatures at what are essentially the equivalent times for migration. So, whoops, we got ahead of ourselves. So in the 1st of April compared to the 1st of November, let's look, you know, the 1st of May when the warblers are just arriving versus the 1st of October when the warblers are just starting to pull out. And you can see it's warmer in the fall than it is in the spring. So conditions are harder for the birds in the spring. The other thing besides it being warmer is the fact that you're having to grow all the greenery, all the insects that the birds are going to feed on, while in the fall, you're basically taking advantage of all summer's worth of growth and insects and so on. And so conditions are much harder for birds in the spring. Migration is, you know, every day is different during migration, but in general, for the most part, we think of migration starting in February. There is some movement in January, but basically in February, you get ducks going. And when you get the first warm up, you start getting the first land birds. These are things like red-winged blackbird, song sparrow, American robin. In March, still ducks, increasing numbers of those early migrants, and then you get things like kinglets, creepers, and sapsuckers. April is basically sparrow month. Most of the species of sparrows coming through then. Phoebes, hermit thrushes, flickers, and yellow-rumped warblers. Then when we get into May, it's warblers. More warblers and more warblers. Yeah, there are other things, but it's basically about the warblers. And then by the time we get into June, migration is largely over. It's the tail ends of everything. The one group that's still migrating in significant numbers are flycatchers. Some species have most of their movement in early June. In fall, I've left out July, which if you're a shorebird person, you're thinking, what about shorebirds? And that's right, the shorebirds are migrating beginning in July. Other things get going in August, swallows, hummingbirds, some of the early departing breeders, things like yellow warbler, orioles will be moving by then. In September, it's the peak of warbler migration, thrushes, tanagers, grosbeaks. This is when the diversity in the fall is highest, is in September. In October, that's the sparrow month, just like April is in the spring. And you also get things like hermit thrushes and flickers. This is the peak of bird numbers. So the peak of species and numbers don't correspond in the fall. They do in the spring. By the time November rolls around, so we're into November, migration is slowing down. There just aren't nearly as many birds. Mostly what you have is smaller number of October migrants. This is when ducks are starting to return in big numbers. And then in December, you've got wintering species. So some of the things that winter here, like snow bunting, basically you'll see migration of them in December. And this is when you're most likely to get eruptive species, things like crossbills and whatnot. Okay, so most species have longer migratory periods in the spring, in the fall than in the spring. Within warblers and sparrows, you see more overlap in the timing of migration in fall than in spring. In spring, things are more spread out when they're coming through. In the fall, they're more sort of right on top of one another. And there are some species that are much more common in one season than another. There are other species most species are about equally common. So this shows data from McCormick Place. And you can see this is a different species of sparrows in the spring. And I chose a bad color pattern, but basically it starts 1st of March and goes to early June. And you can see song sparrows come through first, fox sparrows come at the end of song sparrows. Then in May or in April, you get things like white-throated sparrow, swamp sparrow in big numbers. And then when you get into May, it's Lincolns and white crowns are coming. You may notice there's these sort of double peaks. That's the difference between the males and the females, basically. Now, if we look at fall, everything's piled up on top of one another. Fall for these sparrows is basically all about October. There is some difference within them, but all of them are basically peaking at the same time around the middle of October. Okay, so in the spring, birds are responding to really a phenological event. So that is when the trees are leafing out. For the most part, in the fall, birds are migrating without such a cue. One thing I would say is that water birds, it's a little bit different because they're responding to basically freeze up is a big part of that. In the spring, insects are the dominant food source. There's some flowering trees that are important. There's some seeding trees that are important. In the fall, grass seeds and fruits are very important. And a lot of things that in the spring are treetop birds, especially warblers, in the fall are foraging in ground level herbaceous stuff, especially composites, things like goldenrods and boneset and things like that, where there's still a lot of insects. And so there's a different distribution of things like Nashville warbler and Tennessee warbler and some of the dendroicas that, sorry, I'm showing my age, Setophagus, that in the spring are basically up in the treetops. So in the spring, one of the issues is you have these persistent lake breezes from the northeast. When you have those, it keeps birds off the lakefront. And so there are days in the spring when there basically aren't any migrant landbirds on the lakefront. It also means that the lakefront vegetation is behind the inland vegetation. And that's on average is from 1 to 3 weeks, depending on where you are. The timing of the birds is less. The birds don't quite follow that. So the birds can be on the lakefront in times when really the condition of the vegetation isn't quite ready for them. There's more of a difference in the timing of the vegetation early in the season. As you get later, the inland areas or the lakefront catches up. In the spring, southwest springs bring in the biggest number of birds. The thing you really want to do is get out there on the early days in the flow. So the first day of southwest breezes is the best day to be out there. As you get farther in, you sort of used up the birds that have been held up. Inland numbers are a lot more consistent across days than the lakefront. There's I've looked at data between using Palos and Thatcher Woods inland versus Grant Park, and there's about 3 times more variation in on the lakefront. So on a day where there are lake breezes, going inland can be really a good place to go. In
Hey,
fall
Doug,
migration,
there's this yellow box flashing at the top of your presentation. Is it possible to move that?
I have no idea. Please move this window away from shared application. How do I do that?
Sorry, I'm not sure. It's not a big deal. It's just a little distracting. If it's possible to move that somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know how to. I've not seen that before, and I wasn't sure you all were seeing it, but apparently you are.
All right, well, no problem. We can still read the text. It's just checking.
Okay, sorry. So one thing I'm going to compare blackpoll and bay-breasted warbler, which turn out not to be as closely related as we thought, but are ecologically fairly similar. They winter in very different places. Blackpoll warbler is in South America, while bay-breasted warbler winters in Central America. In spring, they migrate through different areas, with blackpoll warbler island hopping up through the Caribbean, while bay-breasted warbler comes up through Central America. When they get to Illinois, they're basically doing the same thing. They're late migrants, so they come at the end of May. They're primarily inland. They're much more common in the inland forest reserves than along the lakefront. They're big users of the oak canopy in the forest preserves, and they both end up nesting in Canadian spruce forests. So until about August, they're doing pretty much the same thing. Then when they come south, they look basically identical. They're the classic confusing fall warbler. In Illinois, bay-breast is primarily inland in the fall, while blackpoll really builds up big numbers on the lakefront. And bay-breasted warbler is specifically insectivorous, while blackpoll warblers eat a lot of fruit. The reason they're in different places in the fall is they're going to do something very different. The blackpoll warbler is headed to the East Coast. So essentially they're coming through northern Illinois, heading east, not heading south. If you go to southern Illinois, blackpoll warbler is a rare bird in the fall. Bay-breasted warbler is headed down through the Central America again. And blackpoll warbler, which weighs 10 to 12 grams, so half an ounce, makes a single jump from the coast of North America, like New Jersey north for the most part, and makes landfall in northern South America. It's the standard migration of them. So they do that in one continuous flight, and means you shouldn't complain about having to fly across the country. Okay, inland and lakefront are different from one another. The total abundance, I think, is on average higher on the lakefront, but there's some groups that are much higher inland. Vireos are an example. They're much more abundant inland than they are on the lakefront. As I already mentioned, you have a much bigger variability in the number of migrants on the lakefront because of weather. There are some species that are primarily lakefront migrants and some that are inland migrants. This pattern is much stronger in the spring than the fall, where birds are much more widespread, but there are warblers like Tennessee warbler, golden-winged warbler are primarily in inland areas in the spring. In the fall, they can be almost anywhere. Spring migration is delayed compared to on the lakefront compared to inland. And for the birders, there are many more rarities found on the lakefront than inland. Even though there are plenty of birds inland, you just don't get the rarities that you find on the lakefront. Okay, on the lakefront, the habitat we're seeing is mostly city parks. As I mentioned earlier, east winds, there are almost no birds. On southwest winds in the spring, northwest in the fall, you can get major fallouts, and that's one of the things people are really looking for. We have the lake effects, delaying leaf out. On the lakefront, you can have substantial migration into early June. 20 plus species of warblers are possible in June on the lakefront. Basically, in the Chicago lakefront, nothing breeds there. I mean, that's not completely true, but it's pretty close. And there's very little that spends the winter in this lakefront parks. During migration, there's relatively small amounts of song compared to inland areas. So inland, we're talking mostly forest preserve, and this means oak woodlands. You have pretty consistent numbers day to day. It's less influenced by the weather. Spring migration is over by the 1st of May, and sometimes, the last week in May, it's pretty slow going anywhere inland. And birds sing much more persistently, things that aren't nesting here. And so there are days in the spring when you can't hear yourself think because of the Tennessee warblers. Leaf out and migration is earlier in the spring than on the lakefront because the lake winds are keeping things slow. For fallouts, the best thing that you're looking for in spring is strong southwesterly flow and that cold front pre-dawn. That'll really drop birds out. The other thing is the first day of southwesterly flow after you've had a period of cold weather. In the fall, you want the first day following passage of a cold front. Sometimes, even when the cold front doesn't quite get to Chicago, you can get birds coming in big numbers in front of that cold front. So this is my idea of where you should bird on different sorts of wings in the seasons. If the winds are out of the northwest, you should go inland to look for birds. If they're out of the northeast, you go inland as far as you possibly can get. If they're out of the southeast, that tends to create good conditions at the south end of the area. So Calumet, the southern forest preserves, Indiana areas can have quite a few birds, but the lake essentially blocks the movement into farther north parts of the Chicago area. And when the winds are out of the southwest, you want to be on the lakefront. In the fall, if the winds are out of the northwest, you should be on the lakefront. If they're out of the northeast, you're not going to get many land birds, but you could have interesting water birds. In the southeast, you could go pretty much anywhere, but don't expect much. And on the southwest, it's pretty much anywhere, but one thing is that can create conditions which will bring western species onto the lakefront. So things like Franklin's gulls, or those are the conditions that give you the potential for something like cave swallow. Okay, in the spring, in the early part of the season, I think you should be going inland, and especially on warm-ups. As you get later in May and April, you're looking at the lakefront on southwestern winds. In early May, the lakefront won't have the vegetation. It won't have the birds that you'll get inland. Mid-May, it doesn't matter where you are. You can go anywhere and there'll be lots of birds. And then late in the season, late May, early June, lakefront is where there'll still be migrants. In the fall, in August, lakefront is where the birds first start coming in on the cold fronts. September, again, it's like the middle of May. You can bird anywhere and there'll be birds. In October, lakefront on northwest winds. If you've got northeast winds, it can be good for water birds. Those are conditions that might give you a Jaeger or something like that. November, still go to the lakefront on weather, northeast winds, and then cemetery is when you have winter finch eruptions like this year. So I want to talk a little bit about climate change and migration. I have a much longer talk about it, but I do want to bring it up a little bit. In spring, there's phenological change that's happening. You've got a suite of related events occurring. Trees are leafing out, flowering is occurring, insects are emerging, and birds are migrating north to take advantage of that. Mammals and herps are ending their hibernation to take advantage of everything that's coming out. In one of the issues is the timing of leaf out. Insectivorous birds migrating in the spring take advantage of the insects that are associating with leaf out. Leaf out is advancing with global warming. It's about 4 to 5 degrees earlier per degree increase in temperature. One issue that we don't really know for sure is whether the lakefront will become more extreme as the temperatures warm. Essentially, the cause of the lake effect is inland areas warm, the air rises, and it pulls the lake effect winds in. One thing is that continental effects could overwhelm what's happening locally. This shows change in leaf out in North America between 83 and 2005. And you can see most of the country, or most of the continent is coming out earlier, but there are areas that are later, and in particular, note that the southeast is actually delayed compared to what it was in the 80s. And so birds migrating north from South America and Central America hit that, and that can slow them up so they don't take advantage of the fact that the vegetation is more advanced farther north. So the timing of bird migration is set by climate when you think in evolutionary time. It's influenced every year by when they leave, where they winter, and the weather conditions once they start migrating. They use photoperiod, landbirds for the most part use photoperiod to tell them when to migrate. So photoperiod is the length of the day. And so regardless of what the weather looks like, essentially birds leave their wintering grounds at the same time every year. The reason they don't use weather is that the weather is too variable, and birds in other areas can't judge what the weather is like here. They don't get cable in the forests of Central America, and they don't hear what Tom Skilling's telling them about the weather. With migration, what we're seeing, despite the fact photoperiod primarily sets the timing, is there's much evidence of migration changing its timing, becoming earlier in the spring. The timing of leaf out is coming earlier, but it's much more variable because it's set by the weather. The effects on the timing of migration are strongest in the spring. There's very little effect in the fall, and this is because there's a clear phenological event that the birds are responding to, which is leaf out and green up, and their selection for early arrival on the breeding grounds. We've looked at this some with data from McCormick Place, and we looked at 5 common migrants, and what we found in spring, this is between the 80s and the mid 2000s, about 2010. All 5 of these species are earlier spring migrants, between 2 and 7 days earlier. In all of them, we don't see any change in the timing of fall migration. And we don't see a change in the timing of males and females. One thought was there might be one of the ways that it changed was by shifting the relative timing of males and females, but that doesn't seem to be happening. Why does this matter? Well, both birds and plants benefit from the birds arriving at time of leaf out. The birds get food. That's when the most food is there. Plants get pest control. The birds are eating the insects. And several studies have been done looking at this in the Midwest, and they've shown that migrant warblers forage at a lower rate when the year is advanced, when it's warmer than average and the trees have leafed out earlier. And the trees have more leaf damage. There's similar studies have been done in Champaign showing that in a warm year, you've got warblers foraging at a slower rate and more insect damage occurring. So this is the sort of thing, the variation we're seeing right now probably isn't enough to make long-term differences to either the birds or the plants, but it's the sort of thing, if it becomes a consistent pattern, which is what we expect with climate change, it could affect both groups negatively. Okay, you thought I'd totally forgotten about shorebirds, and I haven't, even though I have a very poor shorebird year list this year. I'll talk a little bit about shorebirds. Migration in shorebirds goes on forever. They start in March. They migrate north until late June, and then about a week later, they start heading south, starting in early July, and they go to about mid-November. In spring, the migration is pulsed. There are some very early migrants in March, some that are very late, and things are very much spread out. In fall, you have a pretty early peak in August, and then from that point on, things just kind of get lower and lower until they're mostly gone. There are some species that are pretty much exclusively found in the fall among shorebirds, including buff-breasted and bared sandpipers. The Chicago area is not a great place for shorebirds, but the Illinois River Valley is globally important. When I say Chicago is not a great place, probably the best place for shorebirds in the Chicago area is Montrose, which is a sad statement, given that the number of shorebirds coming through there is just not that high. The diversity tends to be pretty good, but the number is pretty trivial. In spring, ephemeral wetlands in agricultural areas, so the infamous floodals, and in grasslands are important areas for shorebirds. In the fall, primarily what you're looking at is the edge of lakes and rivers that have been exposed by falling water levels, and that's what makes the Illinois River Valley so good. They're very opportunistic about finding appropriate habitat conditions. Essentially, it's almost a given that if it was good last year here, it will not be good this year. It will be good somewhere else. So there are also eruptive species, which right now we're having a pretty good eruption of winter finches. I have evening grosbeak there to encourage me to see evening grosbeaks. There seems to be a pretty good movement going on for evening grosbeaks across the eastern US. There's been a huge movement of pine siskins, and there are things like redpolls and crossbills are showing up. So it looks pretty good for them. Northern shrike is another eruptive species. The winter finches are mostly responding to conifer cone crops. Redpolls and siskins are also responding to things like alders and birches. But northern shrike, I don't really know what it is that drives those eruptions. It may be that it's small rodents, even though they're pretty broad. With rough-legged hawk, which is eruptive, we know it's voles. With snowy owl, it's populations of lemmings that they're responding to. In thinking about conservation in the Chicago area, we can think about grassland breeding birds, migrant woodland birds, some shrubland breeding birds, and marsh breeding birds. Migrant landbirds, I think the thing we want to be thinking about are those species that have small populations and are declining, and especially species that have the bulk of their population in the Western Great Lakes on west. And this gives an example of this with golden-winged warbler and black-throated blue, both of which are great birds. I always love seeing them. And they're pretty close to equally common in the Chicago area. The differences in black-throated blue were at the western edge of their range. They're primarily an Appalachian and northeastern breeder, while with golden wings, the main population is north of us. So the golden wings are important. In migrating, golden wings are mostly inland in spring, while black-throated blue is more common on the lakefront. Golden wing is one of the species that focuses on oaks, although they also use flowering trees in the spring. Black-throated blues are not particularly tied to oaks. I already talked about where they're different breeding zones. They winter in different places. The golden wings are in the mountains of southern Central America and northern South America, while black-throated blue winters in the Caribbean. And golden wings are declining really rapidly, while black-throated blues are fairly stable. And Chicago area is a crucial stopover place for golden-winged warbler, while for black-throated blue, we're really not particularly important to that population. Oaks are a huge issue for the birds around here. Study done using a lot of community scientists found there are species that are strongly tied to oaks, and I've listed the sort of top ones there. And then there are other ones that either are use oaks only as they're found or actively sort of avoid oaks. And these are things like American redstart is an example here. It basically uses early successional vegetation and not mature woods where you would find oaks. So with oaks being important to a number of species and the migration peaking at a time when oaks are flowering and the leaf out is occurring, what happens if that peak of migration and leaf out no longer correspond because of changing climate? And this is a set of species, all of which are oak migrants, so species that tend to use oak. I should put the names on here so I don't have to tell you, but here blue-winged warbler, and I'm blanking out, blue-gray gnatcatcher, rose-breasted grosbeak, black-billed cuckoo, bay-breasted warbler, which despite the fact it's not in an oak here, was the most oak-related species in the study, Blackburnian warbler, golden-winged warbler, Tennessee warbler, and black-throated green. And this is a study that was done about 10 years ago, looking at what the areas were that were important for migrants in the Chicago area. I would note that it does not show the lakefront, and that's because the lakefront areas were too small for this. Were too small for the technique that was used here. But the thing you can see is the water, the river areas inland, and then there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of woodland in northwestern Indiana that's really potentially important for migrants. And with that, I'm done.
All right. Thank you so much, Doug.
There we go.
There we go. Now we get the Brady Bunch view again. So we got a couple of questions already in here in the chat. Daniel Gerds, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. You had the first question that was slapped in there. Would you like to unmute and ask that in person? Maybe. Daniel Gerdes, sorry. No? Okay.
Should I answer the question anyway?
Yeah, no, definitely.
So the question is, how disruptive are the city lights at night to natural migration movements? And the answer is that it's very disruptive. I mean, we know from work we've done at McCormick Place that at the very local level, when buildings are lit up, they're much more likely to kill birds. But there's also evidence from all over the eastern United States that birds are attracted to the lit up cities. So at a grosser scale, it tends to bring birds in toward the city, where there are other their buildings are a hazard, and there are other hazards that they have to face. And in many cities, there's not much habitat.
And Aisha actually had an interesting follow-up question to that as well, is about light types.
Yeah, and I think the answer is that LEDs are better, but it's not straightforward. It's a little bit complicated, but it's at the same light level. The LEDs are better, but they tend to be brighter than other kinds of lights.
Okay, Brotherton, you had a question about the lakefront, and actually I was curious about the, unmute yourself and ask that question in person.
Yes. How far inland do you have to be to no longer be on the lakefront?
So the answer is that as soon as you move off the immediate lakefront, it starts to change, but it's not sort of, I mean, I presented it as a yes, no, and I was using pretty far inland versus right on the lakefront, but places that are close to the lake, but not on the lake, are kind of intermediate in the way they look. So like the Calumet region, which is, not right on the lake, but within a couple of miles, has some things where it's like the lakefront, and some things where it's like inland. So it is a continuum.
All right. Annette Moore had an interesting question about oaks. Annette, would you like to unmute and ask that question in person?
Sure. Hi, Doug.
Right.
I was wondering, has the loss of oak trees due to disease such as oak wilt impacted bird migration? Has there been studies done?
What I'd say is that I don't think we have a good answer for that yet. I think it's something that my guess is at this point, it hasn't had a big enough effect on the oak populations to really be a big issue yet, but it's something to watch out for. I mean, it's one of those things like, we've lost chestnuts. We're in the process of losing ashes. We've mostly lost elms, and all those things have effects. We haven't had the opportunity really to look at what that's done. But elms are a big spring resource for birds, and they're much less common than they were. They probably makes oaks that much more critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a similar vein, there's probably a lot of questions that could be answered about what happened after ashes were all eliminated by emerald ash borer, very similarly.
Right, and ashes are an important resource. They're not, I don't think of them as one of the ones that sort of stands out as better than average, the way elms and oaks do. In the longer version, talking about climate change, on elms, there's a particular elm leaf beetle that is very responsive to temperature. And so in warm springs, it comes out early. In normal springs, it comes out in early May when the oaks are also coming out, and is part of that big jump in food resources. So in warm years, that resource comes out too early, and there is evidence on that. And I suspect you have something similar with oaks. With ashes, I don't have a good sense of what their kind of phenological response and all these things is. Maples are a big thing in April, and they get heavy use in April, but they're really not as good for insects as the oaks are early in the season, or elms are.
We got a question here from Huggins. That's our next question. You want to unmute and ask it?
Hey, Doug.
Hi.
Hey, we've obviously you mentioned on the presentation about the big influx of northern finches. So I got I guess two-part question really. What's going on up north to drive all these boreal species down? And what do you think of the chances of us finally getting a pine grosbeak here in Chicago?
So I've been in Illinois for 30 some odd years and have never seen a pine grosbeak. So I'm not thinking it likely. I haven't really heard of pine grosbeaks showing up in huge numbers north of us, which we usually see when things are coming in. We get we start seeing records of them from Michigan and Wisconsin. So it's what's going on with evening grosbeak right now is I think and this is the first big evening grosbeak year potentially since I've been here already. There have been enough to make me think this is going to be a good year. Pine grosbeaks have been really great. The thing that drives this is food supply, which mostly means conifers. The problem is, of course, that all of these species have different conifers that they focus on. And the most obvious place you can see that is with the crossbills. Red crossbill and white-winged crossbill both erupt, but their eruptions are not timed together. And it's because white-winged crossbills are basically spruce species, while the red crossbills that come through here are mostly pine species, and those are not tied together. So on something like and what's happening with this year, I don't know. There was a guy named, was his name? Ron Pittaway, I think, who used to do a forecast, and he was up in Canada and he was doing it for Ontario, but it had pretty good information for all of the Eastern United States. Well, he retired and we don't have that. So I don't have a good feel for what's happening. It looks pretty clear like there's a poor cone crop, but how broad that poorness is, I don't know. We've got red crossbills. Bob Hughes had white-winged at Montrose, but my sense is that maybe it's going to be red crossbills and not much in the way of white-winged, but we'll see. Sometimes when the cone crops are poor but not terrible, it'll be delayed and there'll be, so one of the big white-winged crossbill years, they really didn't arrive until January. More typically, they start showing up about now. So that was a long-winded answer to say I have no idea, really. I'm betting against pine grosbeak, but I would love it if there's a flock of pine grosbeaks out at Morton Arboretum or something.
Yeah, it would be nice.
Yeah.
Eruption year for the ages there for the history books. We got two questions from Laura Dirks. Would you like to unmute and ask those questions?
Sure. Hi. I just was wondering what this administration or the previous one has responded when it's been proposed to create more habitat for migrating birds or make the city more bird friendly, not to mention the building issue that you put in the Chicago Tribune. And then just wanted to know what other areas of the country experience a similar migration pattern, if there is one.
Yeah, and so what I would say is, the Park District, the Chicago Park District has been good on creating habitat, and I think in the time, so I've been here since the 80s, and when I got here, when you went to Montrose, what it consisted of was lawns, scattered trees, and the magic hedge, and that was it. And now Montrose is an incredible site with all sorts of different sorts of habitats and so on. And they've done that in a lot of places in the city, both in the lakefronts and then in big inland parks where they've focused on habitats around the lagoons. So I think the Park District has done a fair amount. The city, beginning with the Daley administration, has been pretty active in doing tree planting. And I didn't really talk about it in this talk, but one of the things that I just love about Chicago is when migration is going on, your street trees are important habitat for birds. And they've done a good job of diversifying street trees and adding street trees in a lot of places. So I would give Chicago pretty high marks on their responses to creating habitat. It's not always, street trees are mostly not thinking about birds, but the birds get the benefit from trees that are planted, more to create conditions that people like. In terms of the migration, every place is a little bit different. Chicago has a really, a lot of what makes Chicago the way it is its unique geography. And being on the edge of Great Lakes is an important part of it. Being immediately north of this huge area of primarily agricultural land means that birds are really focused on finding places right here. It's almost like the Gulf Coast in some ways, where they've gone across all this area where they couldn't land, and now they finally find habitat. So at the same time, almost every place has good stuff. Different places have different advantages. The Cleveland area is a long lake area, and that's a spectacular place for migration, both on the north side and the south side. So Chicago is great. There are all sorts of great things here, but there are other places that are great too.
Yeah, I think I'd also second that. COS partners with the Park District on a number of different initiatives, whether that's to specific birds like the plovers at Montrose or certain habitats like a big marsh park. But in general, I mean, some of the work that has been truly phenomenal, like for example, a big marsh, which was basically just a massive dump, which they have completely turned over into this breeding bird haven. So definitely second a lot what Doug said there. Nathan's got an interesting loaded question here. Go for it.
Hey, Doug. I was curious. So I know that, we have this McCormick data set of window kills over 30 to 40 years that Dave Willard has collected. How much less do you think we would know about Chicago bird migration and the science behind it, gender breakdowns and whatnot, if we just didn't have that data set? Or would would you find that the window kills from downtown, would help in that regard?
So it's an important data set. It's one that's really useful and easy for me to access. It has the advantage of being, in some respects, unbiased within a species. So like you don't have, basically it doesn't look like, adult males avoid hitting or they hit more often. And for a lot of other things, you tend to bias the data set because adult males are so much more noticeable than any other age or sex class. So that's an advantage it has. And certainly the fact that we can sex and age every bird we get makes it useful. I'm not sure, if we didn't have McCormick Place, we'd still know a lot. And because there are a variety of other data sets. And like on the climate change thing, I've done work using eBird data. And eBird data has all sorts of disadvantages, but it's such a huge data set that makes it possible for common birds for you to tell a lot about what's going on there. And in eBird, you can really see the changes in timing and migration. The problem with McCormick Place for some things is it's just at McCormick Place, so you can't really look at differences like between different sorts of habitats or that kind of thing, which you can do with eBird potentially. And you've also got banding sites all through the Midwest, which are an important thing. And one important thing that's happening right now is they're starting to do that at Big Marsh, because really we haven't had a good banding site in Chicago area for some time. And I think that can give you data, and all that data sort of rolls up together. I think, McCormick, I used that for this, but there are other data sets out there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for that plug, Doug, for our banding station down at Big Marsh there. But I don't see any other questions in the chat. Anybody else? Last call? No? All right, then I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up here. But can I get a real big round of virtual applause here for Doug Stotz? Thank you so much. You use that applause emoji down there. You can find it, your thumbs up if you approve. But seriously, I mean, this was really, really informative. We really appreciate you taking the time this evening to share your knowledge with us. This is fantastic. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
I dropped a link in a chat, and we are Chicago Ornithological Society. If you liked what you heard here tonight, would like to support continuing to have all these programs for free and open to the public, please consider becoming a member or supporting said bird banding station down at Big Marsh. That is funded through membership dollars. Folks like you guys becoming members allows us to install that station and start collecting that important data that allows us to learn more about migration and how to make conservation decisions and help support birds. So consider hopping over to our website, becoming a member today. It's a renewal season, just in case any of y'all are current members and need to re-up on. And in general, also visit our website for upcoming events. This event has been recorded. We're going to be putting this up on our YouTube page, hopefully within the next day or two here. So if you want to come back to this and reference it, you can. And I guess, yeah, without further ado, thank you guys so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you guys again at a future program or event. And once again, thank you so much, Doug, for being our guest here tonight. Have a great night, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.